Sergei Eisenstein is widely regarded as one of the great film directors, a pioneer in the art form of the 20th century, an influence on filmmakers right to the present day. Yet Eisenstein was essentially an investigator in search of an art form that had not yet been created. Although Eisenstein's theories were constantly evolving at a much faster rate than he was able to make films, many aspects of his thought can be found in his earliest writings and attitudes, formed before he'd ever made a film, while he was working in the theatre. Mikhailovich Eisenstein was born in Riga, Latvia, on January the 23rd, 1898. His upbringing was fairly typical of that of the Russian middle classes of the time. His father headed the construction department of the local railway company. He was a man who was very conscious of his position in the community, much decorated and pedantic, with a pronounced affection for orders, ranks, and personal flattery.
Nothing pleased him more than when I had done well at school. I would be called into the drawing room and made to recite my marks and prizes to my proud father and his assembled guests. Then I was allowed to go.
In his role of architect, he had an obsession with the modern style, in which he was once able to construct an entire street, decorating the facade with gigantic figures of naked Amazons cast in iron. He was much disliked and feared by his wife and his son.
He kept his patent leather boots in a boot garage, in strictly designated rows, new, old, scratched, and so on, and regularly he would subject them to minute inspections. Sometimes I was allowed to accompany him on his rounds. As a treat, my father would take me to the circus. What attracted him most of all was high-class equestrianship, so I carefully concealed my passion for the clowns and pretended to be wildly interested in the horses. I was a sickeningly exemplary child who behaved in a sickeningly exemplary manner. My mother was given to violent changes in mood. Once, when we were alone in the summer house, she told me that she wasn't my mother. As she said it, her face became set, her eyes glassy and staring. Then she came slowly towards me. I would turn to my nurse for comfort. She was a peasant woman of simple tastes, and in our many hours together she introduced me to the wonder world of fairy tales and legends, the great power residing in icons and amulets. She told me stories of the saints and their wonderful visions and the miracles they performed. She also took me to the cinema.
From an early age, Sergei was showered with books by his mother, partly from the hope he would outshine his father. By the age of 10, he was fluent in English, French, and German, and reading the classics in the original.
I had exhausted all the books of Dumas. Then the excitement of revolt was given a new lease of life, with a wonderful Christmas present, Mignet's History of the French Revolution. From then, my imagination was fired by the symbol of the guillotine, the clash of arms and the executions, the joyful chaos in the streets.
And after that came Napoleon, his father's idol, Dickens and Zola, and Dostoevsky, Edgar Allan Poe, the Paris Commune. In 1915, at the age of 17, Sergei set off to follow in his father's footsteps and enrolled at the Petrograd Institute of Civil Engineering, where he stayed until he was forced out by the Civil War.
In the early 1920s, we all came to the Soviet cinema as something not yet existent. We came upon no ready-built city. There were no squares, no streets laid out, not even little crooked lanes or blind alleys, such as we might find in the cine-metropolis of our day. We came like Bedouins or gold-seekers to a place with unimaginably great possibilities, only a small section of which has even now been developed. In those early days, a tangle of the widest variety of films was projected on our screens. From out of this weird hash of foreign films and their pale Russian imitations, two main streams began to emerge. On the one side was the cinema of our neighbour, post-war Germany. Mysticism, decadence, dismal fantasy followed in the wake of the unsuccessful revolution of 1923, and the screen was quick to reflect this mood. Nosferatu the vampire, the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, the mysterious warning shadows, the mystical criminal, Dr. Mabuse the gambler, reaching out towards us from our screens, achieved the limits of horror, showing us the future as an unrelieved night crowded with sinister shadows and crimes. Expressionism left barely a trace in our cinema. This painted, hypnotic Saint Sebastian of the cinema was too alien to the young, robust spirit and body of the rising class. Our spirit urged us towards life, amidst the people, into the surging actuality of a regenerating country. The other cinema came to us dashing along in such films as The Grey Shadow, The House of Hate, The Mark of Zorro. A far cry from the silent hysteria of the German cinema, that barbaric carnival, that destruction of the healthy human infancy of our art. The American cinema was, on the contrary, captivating and attractive. It engaged the attention of the young and future filmmakers, exactly as the young and future engineers of the time were attracted by the specimens of engineering techniques, of which we were totally ignorant, sent from that same unknown, distant land across the sea. What enthralled us was not only these films, it was also their possibilities. Just as it was the possibilities in Attractor, the collective cultivations of the field of reality, it was the boundless temperament and tempo of these amazing, and amazingly useless, works from an unknown country that led us to muse on the possibilities of a profound, intelligent, class-directed use of this wonderful tool. For us, all art must be based on a class approach. There has to be a specific purpose in the work, a socially useful, emotional and psychological effect on the audience. The bourgeois cinema is no less aware than we of the class approach. For example, in New York City's censorship regulations, we find a list of thematic attractions undesirable for film use: sexual perversion, excessive brutality, physical deformity, and relations between labor and capital. We know from whence the cinema appeared first as a worldwide phenomenon. We know the inseparable link between the cinema and the industrial development of America. We know how production, art, and literature reflect the capitalist breadth of the USA. And we also know that American capitalism finds its sharpest and most expressive reflection in the American cinema. Our task lay not purely in making good films. The area of our task was much broader, the whole area of culture, to replace the dead bourgeois culture by constructing a contrasting culture and art. And yet, how were we to beat these giants of the American cinema, and just as we were taking our first timid steps in filmmaking? How could our young cinema be heard with a voice of its own against the noisy roar of the American-European film industry that controlled all the channels of trade and production? How are we to counter galaxies of stars, rampant individualism, and the insidious triangle dramas of bourgeois cinema? The answer came, quite simply. What if we turned our backs on all that, and built with quite different materials?
At the end of the Civil War, Moscow was starving. The winter of 1920 was extremely bitter. We were lucky if we found a piece of bread to eat. To keep alive, people were having to cook horse dung in polluted river water.
Yet in the midst of this, a great... Every day astounding new precepts were being put forward, only to be thrown out the next for something even more revolutionary.
We do not need a mausoleum of art where dead works are worshipped, but a living factory of the human spirit, in the streets, in the tramways, in the factories, workshops and workers' homes.
The masses left the theatres to join in the pageants and demonstrations reenacting those historic October days.
And at the same time, Stanislavski continued to produce his psychological plays, Meyerhold to experiment with his fantastic urban theatre. The circus and the Commedia dell'arte flourished side by side with the revival of reality and the death of art.
Fiction is the opium of the people. There is no need to wait for Tolstoy's. We have our own epics. Our epics are the newspapers.
The revolution flung open the door to delirious experiment, and the avant-garde, starved for generations of any link with reality, was at last able to find its role in feeding the millions, and in turn being nurtured by them.
We declare that the splendour of the world has been enriched by a new beauty, the beauty of speed. A racing car, its bonnet draped with exhaust pipes like fire-breathing serpents, a roaring racing car rattling along like a machine gun, is more beautiful than the winged victory of Samothrace.
Like us, the Italian futurists were in revolt against the seemingly endless cycle of life in their country. The old ideas and attitudes had the dead weight of eternity. The whole country seemed like a mausoleum for art objects, quite irrelevant in the dynamic 20th century. But unlike us, the Italians saw the machine as a power to which all must be sacrificed, a potent destructive force. We saw the machine as the means of fulfilling the promise of revolution, and equally, the revolution as giving us the means to fulfill the promise of the machine. The machine is a liberating force from the tyranny of nature. It gives man the possibility of creating an entirely man-made world from the ashes of a feudal society, a world of which he will finally be master.
A new man will emerge from the power of the machine, a superman, a man become machine.
Into the joyful chaos of 1920, there wandered a young soldier fresh from the front and looking for a job in the theatre, Sergei Mikhailovich Eisenstein. When he found work, it was as set designer to the Workers' Theatre. At that time, the whole thrust of Soviet theatre was in the attack on the naturalism of the traditional theatre embodied by Stanislavski, still very popular in revolutionary Moscow. Then, as before the revolution, this anti-naturalistic movement was led by Meyerhold.
What is the point of Stanislavski breeding emotions in actors by telling them, for instance, say mother as if she were a long way away, when what he should be telling them is, say mother louder? Naturalism is not natural, it is life shaped beyond recognition so that it appears natural on the stage. We fight the dry rot of psychological realism and academic boredom with the weapons of low living and direct shock treatment of the brain. We will not be calm. We will bring the circus and the music hall right into the drawing room, and in so doing will bring the proscenium arch down about the audience's ears. There is no more room for butlers listening at the keyholes of life.
Meyerhold believed the old world and its theatre, especially its theatre, could be best destroyed by making it ridiculous, and by replacing it with a theatre that had its roots in a fantastic folkloric popular idiom, the commedia dell'arte, kabuki, the circus, a theatre that was at the same time essentially modern, a theatre of industrialization, urbanism and revolution, a theatre utilizing stark constructivist decor, the music of the production line, rhythmic stylized speech, exaggerated mechanical movements.
This was of course being done by the avant-garde all over Europe. They too were experimenting. But they were regarded somewhat as a freak show, used by affluent theatre-goers to bring relief to their jaded palates. Only in Soviet art was there a feeling that all this experiment had a purpose. In the workers' theatre, Eisenstein learned quickly, providing novel solutions to the staging of new plays.
In the Mexican, the climax was a boxing match. The orthodox convention would be that the match happened off stage, with the audience interpreting the reactions of the actors. Eisenstein's strategy was to set up the boxing ring in full view of the audience, staging the fight as a real event, so real that the outcome of the fight was always in doubt, even to the participants.
I now recognize this as a specifically cinematic technique, as distinct from the purely theatrical element of reacting to events.
In Precipice, a mad inventor is chased by gangsters through an American city. To link the characters inextricably with the tremendous dynamism of the metropolis, mobile props were used. Actors moved around on roller skates, pulling a piece of the city with them.
I still remember the four legs of two bankers supporting the facade of the stock exchange, with two top hats crowning the whole. There was also a policeman, spliced and corded with traffic, and costumes blazing with perspectives of twirling lights, with only great rouge lips visible above.
Eisenstein later saw this as an embryonic use of close-ups and multiple exposures, the superimposition of images of man onto images of buildings.
A film element that tried to fit itself onto the stubborn stage.
In other productions, Eisenstein extensively used jazz, then decidedly avant-garde, circus and commedia dell'arte techniques, masks, tricks, acrobatics, and the Soviet love of America and urban life. For example, an entirely vertical set, the actors clambering over the frame of a huge window with a panoramic view of New York, ablaze with dazzling neon advertisements.
The tempo of the revolution is that of scandal and publicity, electrification of Gogol, musical, Americanism, Grand Guignol.
Our theatre needs to be as directly active as Theatre Guignol, where an eye is gouged out, an arm or leg amputated, before the very eyes of the audience.
I dream of a theatre of such emotional saturation that the wrath of a man will be expressed in a backward somersault from a trapeze, exultation through a salto mortale, lyricism on the mast of death.
The stimulus that the audience feels when watching acrobatics lie at root in the biological makeup of man.
Our theories of theatre were influenced by Pavlov, as well as the current demands of political agitation and the traditional avant-garde technique of shocking the spectator.
In 1921, Eisenstein was finally able to study with Meyerhold, who was then working on his latest and final theory of acting, biomechanics.
Kleist says, "Grace appears in that human bodily structure which has an infinite consciousness, or no consciousness at all, that is, in the god or in the mechanical puppet." And Pavlov says, "The actor must be able to respond to stimuli."
Biomechanics is a combination of military drill and algebra. A principle of analysis has been established by which each movement of the body can be differentiated and made expressive. Like kabuki, acting with only the right arm, acting with one leg, acting with the neck and head only. The human body can be seen as a robot, whose muscles and tendons are like pistons and rods. The actor is a machine composed of many interlocking parts. The good actor, and anybody who is physically fit can become a good actor, is one with a minimum reaction time.
As a theory, biomechanics has its social basis in the physical organization of workers. Let us take the storm of the revolution in Soviet Russia, unite it to the pulse of American life, and do our work like a chronometer.
While the theatre was turning itself inside out, the first steps were being taken in the development of a true Soviet cinema. In 1920, Lev Kuleshov, a teacher at the State Film School, had set up a workshop to carry out experiments in editing.
Our concept of typage springs from the experiments of Kuleshov, but it is also, through our workings in the theatre, a modern development of the commedia dell'arte. Modern film typage is based on the need for presenting each character in our first glimpse of him so sharply and completely that further use of this character may be as a known given element that can be used repeatedly and moulded to the filmmaker's wishes.
In Commedia dell'arte, there are 7 stock types who are immediately recognized by the audience. Upon the entrance of Pantaloon or the Captain, their masks tell the audience immediately what to expect of these figures. And this reaction by the audience is extended in the modern theatre, when we replace, say, Pantaloon with Morgan, the Wall Street banker.
The director's task in casting is not to find good actors. Anybody can be a good actor, but to find people that look right, so the audience will be able to recognize what they represent immediately.
Just as montage, a simple term for a physical process of film editing, has been transformed to broader terms and a deeper process by Soviet filmmakers, so typage is the elevation of typecasting of non-actors to the level of a conscious creative instrument.
Like Commedia dell'arte, many of the concepts and techniques that were being used in the new theatre were centuries old. Some of these had to be given a more explicitly revolutionary context.
The circus needs the revolution as much as the revolution needs the circus. The circus is an important aspect of Soviet life. Witness how many people, even the most socially conscious, are magnetically drawn to it. Yet, if the circus remains outside the movement to communism, if it remains an entertainment, a diversion from the goals of communism, it is worthless.
Eisenstein now aimed at bringing all the influences on the new theatre together as a new theatrical principle.
Yakovlevich gave him the name for his principle by bursting into Eisenstein's room, straight off the American mountains at the Lunar Amusement Park, and babbling away about this roller coaster, my favorite attraction.
Attractions. We'll call our work stage attractions. After all, I want our audience to be as shaken up by our stuff as they are by that roller coaster. No, even more so.
The aim of the theory is to attract the audience, sometimes to pulverize it, to smash an artistic fist in its face by a carefully planned sequence of attractions.
The weapons for our purpose are to be found in all the leftover apparatus of the theatre. The chatter of Ustashov, no more than the pink tights of the prima donna. A roll on the kettle drums, as much as Romeo's soliloquy. The cricket on the hearth, no less than the cannon fired over the heads of the audience. For all, in their individual ways, bring us to a certain ideal, their common quality of attraction. The attraction in the theatre is every aggressive moment in it, every element of it that illuminates in the spectator those senses or frames of mind that influence his experience.
Don't forget it was a young engineer who was bent on finding a scientific approach to the secrets and mysteries of art. The disciplines he had studied had taught him one thing: Knowledge starts where it is possible to apply a unit of measurement to the object under investigation. So he set off in search of the unit of impression produced by art.
Science knows ions, electrons, neutrons. Let there be attraction in art. We borrowed from industry a word denoting the assembling of machinery, pipes, machine tools. This striking word, meaning assembling, is montage. Very well. Let units of impression combined into one whole be expressed through a dual term, half industrial and half music hall. Thus was the term montage of attractions created.
In 1923, Eisenstein put his ideas into practice with the first production he directed, The Wise Man. Throughout the show there was a motley coming and going of actors from all parts of the auditorium, acrobatics and tricks, politics on the high wire, and assault from tightrope. Risque music hall songs were performed by an actress on the vaulting horse, her false breasts lit up by light bulbs. A solemn procession of priests turned into a rout of bureaucrats, squirting water over themselves and the audience. As a finale, firecrackers exploded under the audience's seats.
Perhaps most important was the use of attractions as a means of expression, and these were the elements of an embryonic film montage.
Eisenstein was now becoming increasingly excited with the possibility of film. He spent much of his small amount of free time watching a friend, Esther Schub, in her job as editor for the State Censorship Board.
At that time, all the master film editors were engaged in ingeniously reworking the films imported after the Revolution. I can still remember how I watched as Schub, before my very eyes, virtually remade Lang's Dr. Mabuse, which is now known throughout the Soviet Union as gilded putrefaction. It was in circumstances such as these that the mysteries of montage were revealed to me.
In the theatre, Eisenstein was striving to introduce a greater degree of reality than ever before, to reconcile the conflict between realism of action and artificiality of decor.
It's only logical that if the theatre is to become a factory, the factory should become a theatre.
So, his final play, Gas Masks, was staged in the Moscow gas factory. The audience sat on benches placed around the factory floor. The actors, true to life, wore no makeup. There were no props. The final scene was timed to coincide with the arrival of the actual night shift workers, who took over from the actors and set about lighting their fires as a grand finale. However, the work of the gasworks was being disrupted. After 4 performances, the actors were asked to leave.
The play acting was incompatible with the acrid smell of gas. The audience was overcome, not by our intentions, but by the stench of real life. Our main aim in the theatre was realism, and this has gone as far as it can go in the theatre. We have broken through the auditorium and are propelled towards the cinema screen. The coexistence of theatre and cinema today is like the display at the museum show booth. The skull of Alexander the Great at the age of 25, shown alongside the skull of Alexander the Great at the age of 40. The coexistence is nonsensical. The theatre as an independent unit within a revolutionary framework is out of the question. It is absurd to try to perfect a wooden plough. You must order a tractor. Cinema at present is dull and inefficient, especially that cinema that attempts to give its viewers the impression of reality. Reality speaks very obscurely, if at all. The filmmaker has to rip reality apart to rebuild it into a system capable of generating the greatest possible emotional effects. I get away from realism by going to reality. Realism is my deadly enemy. It is the exact antithesis of all I am trying to do. The realists string their emotions together to give a continuous illusion of reality. I take photographs of reality and then cut them up so as to produce emotions. I believe that material things, that matter, gives us the basis of all our sensations. I am not a realist. I am a materialist. These words, although written by Bertolt Brecht, give a fair indication of what our position is. Meyerhold and the constructivists break up the various aspects of theatre into bits, which can be recomposed according to the formal wishes of the director. Sets function in dialogue with words, which are in dialogue with the lighting, the mise-en-scène, the costumes, the sets, and so on. A democratic harmony of elements, as opposed to a feudal hierarchy. In the cinema, there are two basic features, the shot and the montage of shots. These reproductions of nature and their combinations permit any degree of distortion, either technically unavoidable or deliberately calculated. But the apparent arbitrary relationship of film to the status quo of nature is much less arbitrary than it seems. The final order is ultimately determined, consciously or unconsciously, by the social premises of the filmmaker. His class-determined bias is the basis of the seemingly arbitrary relationship between nature and the meaning of film. I understand cinema as bias, and only bias. It is possible to create, acknowledging on what latent feelings and passions you wish to speculate. We must goad the passions of the spectator. Yes, but we must also employ a safety valve, a lightning rod, and that is bias. Bias is a great artistic potential. To ignore bias is to waste energy, and to waste energy is the greatest crime of our generation. When bias is absent, the cinema becomes merely a time killer, a sedative, a hypnotic, and this becomes bias in support of the status quo, in keeping the audience happy with things as they are. The cinema thus trains the well-balanced, stripped-away wishes of the citizens, just like a church. Isn't this the philosophy of the American happy ending? Even some of our most esteemed filmmakers seem to forget this. For instance, Dziga Vertov, our leading documentarist, who maintains that film, the camera, speaks for itself and is not answerable to any man, least of all the filmmaker. To make no comment, as Vertov claims to do, is a waste of time. Vertov is the February of the cinema, merely the abolition of the tyranny of fictional film. We must move on towards that cinematic October. We do not need a cine eye, we need a cine fist. Each shot of the film must be an attraction, independent but equal to the others, each designed to give the spectator a precise psychological shock. Pudovkin sees the shot from the viewpoint of the filmmaker. A shot is a mere technical step in film production. In contrast, I see this as a question of audience reaction. A shock or attraction is a relation between mind and matter. One cannot talk about a shot without also considering how it is received by an audience. The shot contains both a material and a spiritual side. The audience cannot be a passive recipient. It must aid in forging the meaning of the film. The filmmaker must give the audience not a completed image, but the experience of completing an image. The filmmaker must lead the audience towards the climax with its eyes wide open, exposing his means, his mechanism, not merely as style, in contrast to the illusionary realism of Hollywood, but because the film derives its energy from the conscious mental leaps of the spectator. The audience literally brings to life the dead stimuli, forcing lightning to leap from pole to pole until a whole story is aglow, until the theme is illuminated beyond ignorance and doubt. Our program combines the careful planning of the engineer, the attractions are chosen with the precision of a slide rule, and the sudden inspiration of the artist, through which the exact nature of these attractions are decided only on the spur of the moment.
The events of 1917 resounded throughout the world. Eisenstein was still studying at the Institute of Civil Engineering in Petrograd.
At that time, I had no intention of doing anything else but following my father's footsteps as a civil engineer.
For Eisenstein, the revolution was primarily a source for satirical cartoons. Courting death, he crouched in the doorways, sketching demonstrations and battles in the streets, enjoying his status as a sympathetic observer.
On the night that the Kerensky government fell, I was in a state of great elation. I had just been commissioned to do a whole series of sketches for a Soviet journal.
Engineering continued, as did the exploration of man's soul. Schopenhauer, Hoffmann, Oscar Wilde, devoured by Eisenstein in his room that was becoming increasingly cluttered with books, paintings, objects of all kinds. At this time he had his first contact with a Meyerhold play, a revelation.
From then onwards, the theatre became the object of my intense interest and unbridled lust.
But he didn't do anything about it. Then, in 1918, the Civil War broke out, and the Engineering Institute closed down. The students enlisted en masse in the Red Army, Eisenstein among them, leaving for the front as an engineer.
Everyone knew that all links with the past had been broken, that the only direction left was forwards.
Eisenstein's mother had fled to Paris. His father had joined the White Army to fight against the Reds. His old home had been pulled down, as had his father's cast-iron Amazons, which were turned into sewage pipes.
The chance of escaping the predestined path I had laid down for myself, and the memories of what had led me blindfolded to this path, made my decision to join the Red Army, to commit myself wholeheartedly, perhaps rather an easy one. If it had not been for the Revolution, I should never have broken with the tradition, passed down from father to son, of becoming an engineer. The urge to become an artist was there, but it was only the whirlwind of revolutionary activity that gave me the freedom to take my fate into my own hands.